Welcome to Weekly Ways to Better Days, the podcast, episode 37. I am a cancer survivor last. In this episode, Demelza joins us and tells her story about being diagnosed with ovarian cancer in her late 20s and the journey that she has overcome and how she has created a family and overcome, the hardships that come with being a cancer survivor while not taking it on as her full identity, which I think is so empowering. And so thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Hello, welcome, Demelza. So Demelza is my friend and fellow coach that I met in my life coach certification, and she is amazing and inspiring, and I am so grateful to have you on the podcast today. I know your story is going to be so fruitful for other people to hear, and so go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, all right. So thank you for having me on, Katie. So I am Australian, just in case anyone is wondering about the accent. I am Australian. I grew up in a town just outside of Sydney, but I've been in the US for the last 13 plus years, and I currently live just outside of New York City. So oh my goodness, a little bit about myself. Okay, so I am currently, so let's start with where I am right now. I am currently a career coach, so I specialize in coaching people in relation to their career. I really get excited when I get to talk to people about pivoting. So changing things up, whether it's, looking for that promotion or really like leaving the current path that they're on and wanting to do something brand new that calls to them. So that's really my jam, is like the pivots and like the big pivots. And that's just because I've done it multiple times in my life, with my career specifically. So I have a background in human resources. And it's what I went to university for. And I did that for a good solid 8 to 10 years, working from like small boutique agencies to nonprofits to then like big corporations, like multi-million-dollar corporations and multi-billion-dollar corporations. And then essentially I had a medical diagnosis, which is the big event I think that we're going to be focusing a lot of our conversation on, that really changed my perspective. So it had me pivoting into something completely different. And then after doing that new and completely different thing, it was essentially aesthetics in the service industry. I then kind of pivoted back to my roots of human resources, but in a completely different capacity. But that's pretty much the high level of where we're at. And yeah, a lot of where I am right now is directly correlated to the medical diagnosis I got in like 2012. Yeah.
So let's go ahead and let's share that story.
Yeah, so in 2012, I got diagnosed with cervical cancer. So I was 28 years old. At that point in time, I was married to my husband for about 5 years by then. And of course, he was finishing up grad school, so now we were seriously having that conversation about growing our family. And then, of course, the universe, as we're starting to, go down that route, be a lot more serious about it, I ended up just with a little bit of abnormal bleeding. So I wasn't in any pain. You know, I had been going for checkups. Essentially, I had a clear pap smear like 3 months before, but because of the abnormal bleeding, I went in to my primary care doctor and just thought maybe I had a cut, or just thought I would do my due diligence. And that's when she was like, she did another pap smear. She couldn't see anything, but she was like, you know what, this isn't really my realm. So she hooked me up with a gyno. And then a week later, I went to the gyno. She had my new pap smear results, which were negative, completely negative. So not even abnormal, just negative. And then she was like, okay, well, your test is negative, but you say you've got some bleeding. Let's take a physical look. And she didn't even have to like do anything like super intrusive. I essentially got on the table, allowed her to just take that first peek, and she saw it straight away. She was like, she goes, oh, yep, I see something. It's about the size of an almond. I'll have to take a biopsy. So she took a biopsy, and of course, throwing some more like another spanner in the works is the following day I was actually leaving with my husband for a vacation to the UK. So to London. Wow. So I had told her, I'm like, look, I'm going to be overseas. I will have access to my cell phone. So, if you need me, just call me. And then not 3 days later, we were sitting in a Starbucks on Baker Street in London, and I get a call from her, and she's like, you need to come home. And I'm like, how bad is it? Because at that point, you kind of already have an inkling, right? Mm-hmm. But, we had been 3 days in London already. We were about to get on a Eurostar the following morning to go to Paris. And she's like, no, you really need to come home. And I'm like, well, can you tell me what it is? And she's like, I really can't. Like, you need to come home. So we packed up, went home. Pretty much as soon as I landed, I went straight to the doctor's office. And then that's when she gave me the news. And she's like, I've already lined you up with, an oncologist. And then from there, everything just kind of happened. So yeah, and that's when she gave me the diagnosis of it is cancerous. And then it wasn't until I went to the oncologist that they were able to tell me specifically it was cervical cancer. And then we talked about treat. So do you want me to keep going with
go ahead. Okay.
So then, everything's kind of a blur. And we can talk about my mindset a little later, but just to kind of get the story out of the way, I essentially was going in for surgery because it was small enough for me to have a surgical procedure as opposed to anything more. Then, of course, once they went in and cleared everything, I got the news that it turned out to be a lot more aggressive than they had thought. It was a rare form of cervical cancer because from my understanding back then, cervical cancer is very slow growing. But this one happened to expand in size within 2 weeks.
Wow.
So it went from being like good to go for surgery to the surgical day and like, oh, we really shouldn't have done surgery. But they did it. And, by all accounts, the surgery was a success because they were able to take the tumor out. They took a bunch of lymph nodes out, which all tested negative. The problem was that the size of the tumor had grown so much that they weren't able to get clean margins, like a decent amount of clean margins around the tumor to test the tissue surrounding that. And of course, because of the type of surgery I had, they were now talking about other treatment options. They gave me I think it was at the time, they gave me a 15% chance of the cancer reoccurring in the same area. And, when you think about it, you're like 15% chance, like that's actually pretty good. But when I asked, I'm like, typically with this type of surgery, what percentage are you looking at? They're like, we're looking at a less than 5. So obviously there's a huge difference between less than 5 to like 15. So I ended up, and because I was so young, they were like, your body will heal. So they pushed for radiation. So I got for a couple of months I was getting internal and then external radiation with a small dose of chemo once a week for my internal radiation period. Before I started radiation, though, they moved my ovaries. So they did a couple of things. I was able to work with a fertility clinic to take out eggs. And so we were able to create embryos and have those frozen. They also moved my ovaries out of the radiation zone. And they did that as a preempt, not so that I could procreate more, but it was more because they didn't want me to go into early menopause.
Okay.
So they were attempting to physically remove my ovaries as far as they could outside the radiation zone. So my ovaries ended up getting extended and tacked to like my lower back walls.
Wow.
Yeah, so out of the pelvis region. And so, I went through the process. I was lucky enough that the radiation was pretty straightforward. Even before I had finished, to their point, my body was already healing, so that was good. And because I had very little exposure to chemo, I didn't lose any hair. So my treatment process in the sense was quite normal, but because of the type of treatment I received, the radiation, I was told that I would never be able to carry a child to full term. They just didn't know the extent of damage the radiation would cause in the scar tissuing. It would cause around the uterus to allow the uterus proper expansion past the first trimester. So it would have ended up causing essentially death for any fetus that I was carrying, but also it would potentially put me at great risk as well. So, out of everything, that was probably the most damaging prognosis I received throughout the whole thing, including the diagnosis of cancer. But yeah, so that that was the event, and that all happened within the span of like 6 months.
Wow. That's a lot in
Mm-hmm.
like in 6 months. I mean, even
Mm-hmm.
just from the doctor
Mm-hmm.
going in
Mm-hmm.
and biopsying and
Mm-hmm.
then
Yeah.
calling you. Like, so
Mm-hmm.
really quickly, let's talk about that. Like, so when you got the news, how did
Mm-hmm.
you process that? Because you didn't know what exactly was going on. And like, I mean, that's a flight from New York to London.
Yeah, so, and at the time we were in Boston, so we were
Okay.
living in Boston at the time. So it was about like I think a 5 hour flight.
Okay.
Um, but oh, it was I was okay. Like I kind of so I have, excuse me, my family has a history of cancer, at least my dad did. Um, so in my mind, there's so little known about cancer and whether it's genetic. So I just figured if it is genetic, I have a 1 in 3 chance of getting cancer.
Mhm.
My dad had nose cancer. So I had assumed if I did get cancer, it would be that. Cervical cancer kind of just came out of the blue because there is no family history. So it was a little surprising. But it was interesting. Right from that get go, I knew it was more than likely cancer.
Mhm.
Um, and I was okay with it, like in the sense of not necessarily okay with it, but I accepted it.
Okay.
Um, I had seen my dad overcome cancer, so there was no question of whether I would overcome it. Um, and maybe it was part of my youth where I just figured I can survive, like I'll survive.
Mhm.
But there was no concern like for my life. It was just, okay, we just got to go through this, get it done, whatever it is. And that was probably like right from the beginning. I just let it go. Like I didn't Google anything. I
Mhm.
didn't look anything up. I couldn't even tell you what stage my cancer was at.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you because I never focused on the what is it and why is it happening. I was just so forward thinking that I was like, tell me where I need to go, what I need to do, and when I need to be there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to show up and you're going to do your thing and we're going to move on to the next. I spent very little time dwelling on the details
Mhm.
and why, which kind of looking back on it now, like from the other side, like what are we, like 11 years on? And it's like, ugh, like how do I not even know what stage my cancer was at, you know? Um, and do I have the paperwork? Yeah, so I could look it up. But at the same time, I'm like, it makes no difference now for me. And I
Yeah.
think at and I think at that time as well, maybe I didn't formulate those words or those thoughts, but I was like, knowing why or how this happened is not going to help me fix this or move forward from this. So I didn't even want to waste my time or energy on something that one wouldn't matter to anything moving forward, but two, I couldn't control.
Right.
Like the why and the how, that was in the past. And if I had control over it, I forfeited that, you know, by sheer ignorance. So it was just one of those things where it's like, if I can't control it and it's not going to help move the needle forward, I'm not even going to dwell on it because I got bigger problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty powerful, especially knowing like what we know now because of like going through coach certification and all of that. It was like your natural inclination was to just move forward and not to harp on what you can't control or like this sentiment of like why is this happening? And I think that in itself is so freaking powerful because most people, when they get any sort of diagnosis or something happens, they focus on the why. And so you're just like internalizing it and you're sitting in it. And I feel like, I mean, I truly believe that your mind really dictates also part of your health in your body. So I feel like that is like, to me, astonishing at, you know, your age that happened without knowing what you know now after like we've been through certification and all the mind management, like that your natural space was to just move forward. And I mean, what do you think that helped the process? Like how do you think that impacted it?
I definitely think it helps the process. At least for me as the individual going through it, it definitely helped the fact that I was like that because I wasn't sitting and stewing as to why me. It was just like, well, I kind of had an inkling that I always had a chance of it. So, it's not hugely unexpected. The type of cancer was definitely unexpected, but I didn't even bother to learn a lot about it. Like, I had cousins texting me going, well, good news, Demelza, cervical cancer is one of the most treatable cancers out there. And I'm like, oh, that's good to know, like I just didn't. I think, it it helped that I happen to be in a city that is known for its medical field. Like, when you think of like what's one of the best cities you can think of being in, where you've got access to cutting edge medical technology, it's definitely Boston. And I happen to be in a position where I was working, or I was a patient of both Brigham Women's as well as the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. They were working in partnership on my case. So I guess I had a lot of confidence in my medical providers. But again, I didn't want to waste my energy on anything that I couldn't control. But that also came at a cost. But it came at a cost that I didn't realize till now, in the sense of I never grieved, I remained, if you want to talk about like where I felt the most emotion was probably when I got the phone call saying that, like, when I got diagnosed, I cried one time. It was a burst of tears after we visited the doctor. We were in the car and I cried one time. And by the time I got out of the car, I was done. The more traumatic, I guess, the more significant emotional responses came when I was told that I would never be able to carry. That was the second time I burst out crying during this process. And then I remained angry about it. Because for me, I've always looked at it as my choice, my control was taken from me when it came to my family planning. I no longer had control over how I was going to have children, when I was going to have children, and how many I was going to have, or at least that's what it felt like, because it was just so unknown. Because now, instead of the traditional family planning where it's between you and your partner, it was now between me, my partner, an IVF clinic, and potentially a gestational carrier. Well, actually, it had to be between a gestational carrier, and whether that gestational carrier was going to be someone we knew or someone we built a relationship with. Like, there was just so many unknown variables. And then, we could go down a rabbit hole and talk about like the mental drama that comes with, having a child birthed from not your body. Right? Like,
Yeah.
Because everything out there is about the mother-child bond, and it's like, holy crap, I'm not going to have that. Like, what's that going to look like? Is my child going to recognize me, or acknowledge me as the parent? Like, so, because of the unknowns there was a lot of, that's probably where I felt the most emotion. Sometimes it was anger, sometimes it was a little bit of pity. But that's probably the one piece of the diagnosis where I felt the most emotion.
So where do you think that you processed that throughout the process, or like how did you process it, or is it something that you?
Yeah, so it was kind of almost like, I think what I did was, while I was doing the radiation treatments, so while I was getting treatments for the cancer, it was almost like I put that on a shelf. Because we went through the process of retrieving the eggs, it got frozen, and we were told, just let it be frozen and then think about it once you're done. So then it's one of those things where, yeah, I think throughout the process of the cancer treatment itself, I just ignored it. Yeah, there was a lot of ignoring during this. Like, when I think back and think back on it, like, there was a lot of ignoring. Some of it worked and it turned out to be okay, in the sense of, I have zero regrets about the treatment I did, even though like 5 to 6 years later, it did require me to have a full hysterectomy. Because, what they ended up finding out was the particular treatment steps that I took was somewhat new. So then, there's not a lot of like old data on it. So what they were seeing was, at that 5-6 year mark, a lot of women who had received the treatment that I did were coming up with polyps on their uterus. So I had a full hysterectomy, barring my ovaries again, because they were lifted out. But at that point in time, like, I was like, I don't need it. I don't need my uterus. I don't need my fallopian tube. Like, just take it. If it's going further my health, just take it. And that's how I felt, and that's how I feel about the treatment I received. Is I made the best decisions I could to save my life at that point in time. And there's nothing I would do differently.
Yeah. I mean, that's like, I feel like a powerful, like an empowering stance to have.
Mhm.
But in that sort of situation, did you find it hard to process the fact that you had to then get surgery like years later? Like, how did you process that?
It's so interesting, right? So not really, no. Um, just because I think I just understood that medicine is a little trial and error, right? I was already thankful for the fact that, my treatment process had saved my life, that my treatment process wasn't, you know, um, the traditional type of losing all your hair, getting weak. I mean, I went to work.
Mm.
I was still working while I was getting my treatment. At the tail end of my treatment, I did a complete household move from Boston to Savannah, Georgia.
Wow.
So it didn't really there was nothing about the treatment itself that made me um, pause to be like, you really need to process this. I think where I didn't process was the fact that I had cancer and I survived it.
Mm.
It was just like, now I'm moving on.
So have you processed that? Like at what point did you process it if you have?
To be honest, I don't think I have, because there are moments where I'll listen to survivor stories, and halfway through listening to survivor stories, I'm like, oh crap, I'm a survivor too.
Mm.
Um, but part of me now is maybe, and it's interesting, right? Because I don't think there is anything to process with the actual diagnosis piece of it.
Mhm.
I think, but being more aware that this is actually part of my story, not ignoring it,
Mm.
pretending it never happened. Um, yeah, it's pretty interesting, because it's like, then when I think about, well, if I'm pretending it didn't happen, like, what is that in response to, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't, and maybe it's not ignoring it, but it's not, there's a lot of discounting. Like, I don't feel like I survived, or I don't feel like I did anything great. um, it wasn't a very heroic journey. It was just, I turned up when I was meant to. I was lucky enough to have access to great medical providers and great facilities. And I just did what they said, Um, there
Yeah,
was nothing
that's
to it.
well, it's interesting because it's almost like the way I see it is that that's not a part of your identity per se, where I think
Mhm,
a lot of people latch on, and I'm not saying
mhm,
like I have
mhm,
never had a diagnosis like that, but I think a lot of people latch on to parts of their experiences and create
mhm,
full
mhm,
identities around them.
mhm,
I mean, you see it
mhm,
with any sort of trauma
mhm,
survivor, right? Like a
mhm,
lot of people, like whether they're like
mhm,
a sexual abuse
mhm,
victim or whatever it is, they like create this whole identity around it.
mhm,
And what almost it sounds like is that like you went through it and you did it, and but it's not, you don't have an identity created around it. And it
mhm,
could be because of your experience where
mhm,
it wasn't like you weren't losing hair, you were
mhm,
like, you
mhm,
were still
mhm,
living life and all of
mhm,
that, which
mhm,
is interesting. But I like almost look at it as, when I hear you talk about it, is maybe not so much ignoring it, but just like really that's not what you identify as. Like you have so much
mhm,
other parts of you that you
mhm,
identify
mhm,
with,
mhm,
which I think is probably empowering, right? Like, because you kind of move forward with your life versus being past focused.
Right. And I actually think, as you were talking, I definitely think that that's more of it, because of my diagnosis, I've made so many big life decisions. And I have, like, what drives me now is very different than what drove me before cancer. Right? So, not to say that it's ignored, but you're right. It's not part of my identity in that regard, but it definitely changed my perspective.
Yeah.
It definitely changed my perspective. And I remember the moment I realized my perspective had shifted, because I was working in human resources. And like I said, I was still working during the treatment. And I remember having a meeting with a director of this multi-million-dollar company I was working with at the time. And she was on a warpath. Like, she had some open positions that she wasn't getting any traction with. And because I happened to be the HR person that came into her office to talk about something else, she kind of ripped into me. And I remember having an out-of-body experience, because I was sitting in the meeting and I'm like, if this happened to me 3 weeks ago, I would be holding back tears, trying to get out of this office as soon as possible so that I could burst out crying. But I literally sat there and had the thought, you are currently getting so worked up about recruiting when I am literally going to the hospital every day to receive radiation treatment to save my life.
Wow.
And I was like, and it was almost like, I was like, her emotions are misplaced. This is not a big deal. And it was so funny, because I walked out of that meeting, and like, my response to her also kind of, I think, took her aback, because she was, threatening to go to the president of to her VP, then to the president of the company, to complain about us. And I was like, I literally turned around and said, you do what you feel you need to do, but this is what I'm going to do, because I had no control over the situation she was upset about. So it kind of took her aback, because I was like, I literally cannot help you, but I'm going to have the conversations and let them know that, you're not happy. But if you feel like you need to go escalate this up the chain, by all means, you go ahead and you do you. And I just left the office and I went back to my department, gave the feedback to the recruiting manager, and I'm like, watch out, she's super upset, she's on the warpath, and then I went into my director's office and I said, I don't know how much longer I can be in human resources anymore, because I think I'm losing my empathy. And I explained to her what happened, and she was like, maybe, because I was like, nope. I was literally like, nope, like, that is not important. And you getting worked up about it that much, completely misplaced. So that was the first time my perspective changed.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge because it's not even like, I don't look at it as a loss of empathy. I look at it as a gained perspective of reality and what truly matters.
Well, now when I look back on it, I'm like, it was definitely not a loss of empathy. But at the time, it was like, oh my God, if I can't be empathetic to her current situation and recognize that this is important to her, then how am I going to be empathetic to others? And of course, now through my own, journeys and through coach certification, empathy is not necessary to move the needle forward. Understanding is not necessary. What I actually did, probably for the first time in my life, was hold space for someone that I did not agree with.
Yeah, that's like
You
even
know?
more powerful, is like you didn't jump in the pool, as like Brooke would say, right?
Mhm,
Like, so you weren't sitting in
mhm,
her shit, like getting
mhm,
all frazzled
mhm, mhm,
because you've had this bigger
mhm,
perspective. Like,
mhm,
it's so
mhm,
fascinating because it's like
mhm,
you understand, like, okay, like, of course it's important to hire
mhm,
people and get the,
mhm,
like,
mhm,
that's part of the
mhm,
gig, but like life
mhm,
is so much more than that. And like, this poor woman is just like so immersed in her job and thinks that that's her
mhm,
world, and is like, and so it's like, yeah, what a wild experience. I would say, yeah,
mhm,
it's almost like an outer body experience. Like, you're like,
mhm.
what's going on here?
Yeah, because I recognize that I would have cried.
Yeah.
I would have been crying
Yeah.
if this happened, like, literally 3 weeks before, you
That's
know?
wild.
So that was the first, I guess, big perspective shift. But of course, we moved to Savannah a couple of weeks later, and I ended up back in human resources. And then that's where more shifts came in, right? I realized that there are bigger things happening in life. So I was never truly as invested as I was before my cancer in terms of
Mm.
the workplace problems,
Hmm.
right? Um, I was better able to leave it at work, so to speak. And then, of course, just so everyone knows, I did, and I actually have two boys, an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and they were born via gestational carrier. And that in itself is a whole other piece of it. But with my oldest being born, while we were in Savannah, another shift started to happen in the sense of like what I deemed important.
Mm.
Um, and I realized, like I would say I'm a pretty ambitious individual, you know, and career was one of the places where I put a lot of my ambition in. Um, but with the cancer, and then now with a little boy, and understanding that, you know, there are bigger things at play in life that you never know when or how they're going to show up. I didn't want him to spend 10 hours a day in childcare Monday through Friday. Like
Mm.
he was literally doing a 50-hour work week, the same as
Right.
me. Um, and so it got to a point where I started realizing that time was more important, like the way I spent my time, how I could control my time. And so that's what triggered the other, like my first big pivot was this whole exploration of what can I do to increase the amount of time control that I have. Because working
Mhm.
a corporate job, it's hard.
Right.
especially back then, before there was hybrid or work from home opportunities. It was pretty much on-site Monday through Friday. So that was my first change, where I decided I value my time and I value my son's time, because, this diagnosis has proved, like, what I just went through, like, the money piece is not necessarily a big driver for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's my time and what I'm able to do with it. And so that's what triggered the next pivot. And to be honest, my time is probably my biggest motivator. It's what I've learned, and I would have never learned that, though, if I had not been diagnosed.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I feel like, one of the heaviest perspective shifts someone can have, because most of us live our lives doing things that we don't really want to be doing with our time. And we all have limited time, right? Like the clock is ticking on all of us. And it's just I think when people start to understand that as they get older, and just naturally you're like, okay, well, I know I'm going to eventually run out of time. But I think what an impactful lesson to learn at such a young age, because like you were able to really shift your whole world, realizing like, first off, I'm not going to spend my time getting in other people's shit and getting emotional with other people. And then also I'm going to really decide how I want to spend my time, because it's like almost like, it's limited, even though it's like so fruitful, you have a long life ahead of you, it's still limited. Like we may have another 60 years in us, but it's still limited. I mean, those 60 years can fly by so quickly. And so it's like, I really think it's powerful when people have these big moments and take something away. And that's like obviously what this whole podcast is about, and having guests on is about, is because I think a lot of the time people experience things and they stay in victimhood. And that is a very scary, dark place to be in. Like it really is. And I'm not saying to ignore what you've been through, but I certainly do find so much power and purpose in the lessons that I have learned from the trauma. And I feel like that is the theme probably with all of my guests, is finding power and purpose in the lessons that have come from the trauma. And so it's like learning the lesson of your time is so valuable and what is important. Like, even though it came at a cost, right? There was a cost of you not being able to bear children yourself. But it's so interesting because, like, I remember when you were talking earlier in the podcast about like not having control over, like your pregnancy and all these things, which is so fascinating to me, because when I see it like from an outside perspective, it's like almost like you had even more control, even though it wasn't in your body. You had more control than most people do by like, you could know what the sex is. You could like, you're actually strategically like deciding when this is going to happen. And it's like, and even though I know it may not take, and there's all kinds of factors, right? But it's almost like in the control that you had to like give up, you also gained some other control that other people didn't have in that process of like fine-tuning things that most people don't experience when they have a natural birth, which is fascinating, because it's not to say one is better than the other. It's just interesting to see that perspective.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very, very intentional process. And that in itself, I think for me, the biggest lesson coming out of being diagnosed with cancer is the perspective shift, right? Now, the child rearing, like creating a family, the family planning portion of it, that got blown out of the water because, I had spent 28 years thinking I was going to create a family one particular way. And now I was told, yep, no, you can't do that. So then it's like, I'm sorry, what do we do then, and so it was a very interesting experience. And like I kind of have been saying throughout, is this process was probably the harder process, more so than the actual diagnosis and treatment. It was going through this family planning journey or creating my family in a non-traditional way. That has definitely been more interesting for me, and I would say more unprocessed. I am lucky enough to have been able to had great results. So, like I said, I have 2 boys, and yes, they are biologically mine. So that in itself is a feat, because I meet women who had cervical cancer, 20 years before I got diagnosed, and their only option was adoption.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even have this. So there is definitely privilege, also in the fact that we were able to afford it, because it's not a cheap process. But where I have felt in the past the most emotion, the most anger, is probably the fact that I got robbed of a choice. It's always, up until recently, I've always looked at it as I was backed into a corner. Like, my choice to bear children myself, that was taken away from me. I didn't opt out of it. It got taken away from me. And that's the piece that up until recently, I don't think I had processed very well.
Yeah.
I kept it in anger. Even though my outcome was great, I kept that portion of the fact that I was backed into a corner and given no choice as to how I was going to have children.
So then how did you process that? Like, what is the newfound perspective that has shifted?
So because I very much looked at it as in the lens of anger, it's interesting because now what's actually helping me move forward and accept it is the acknowledgement that that anger, that I'm still stuck in the grieving process. So it's not, so anger is only one piece of it. Now I need to move on and finish out the rest of the grieving.
That's powerful. I mean, that's powerful too, because I think there probably was a little bit of like a stoppage, right? Where like you didn't do the processing because you got 2 great kids, right? So it's like, what do I have to grieve in a sense? But it's like, yes, like processing that grief so that you're no longer angry, and then you can like really be, even though you are deeply appreciative, be even more appreciative, right? Rather than having that little resentment piece. How are you moving through that grieving now?
Slowly.
Yeah.
I think if it wasn't for CCP, yourself and the other ladies within our program, I guess I didn't really realize that grieving is a long process. It's a cyclical process. And I'm actually coming to terms with the fact that it never ends.
Yeah.
Like the grieving will not end, but it will look different over time if I let it.
It evolves.
Yeah, and grieving doesn't mean that you feel sorry for yourself, which is also kind of maybe why I never looked at it as grieving, because I don't feel sorry for
Mm-hmm.
myself. But also being in anger was not serving me,
Mm-hmm.
because, it meant that I could still get triggered and was
Yes.
still getting triggered. And it's so interesting because when you pick it apart, I don't get triggered when I see a pregnant woman, right? But where I did get triggered was when family who we had assumed were done with their growing of a family recently announced that they were expecting their third.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what triggered it. For the first time in like 10 years, I'm like, why am I feeling like this? Because it wasn't anger.
Mm-hmm.
It was like overwhelming sadness at the
Mm-hmm.
loss of an opportunity to have that choice to bring another into the world.
Yeah.
Like
And
if I wanted to. Because, and it's interesting, right? Because I think back to the training and I'm like, well, is that really true? And it's not, because we could explore the surrogacy route again. We could explore adoption again. But they all take more resources
mm-hmm.
than simply, getting together with your partner and trying it, you know?
Right.
And so, there was overwhelming sadness and a little bit of bitterness
Mm-hmm.
that it seemed to go according to plan, like, that things are happening according to plan for like that, a little bit of bitterness that we would never be able to have like the natural or the, I guess, more traditional, natural creation of life, you
Yeah,
know?
it's almost like I think it sounds like you didn't fully mourn the fact that
Mm-hmm.
you weren't
Mm-hmm.
able to like have children the way that other women get to experience it. And so,
Well, that society intended, because here's the
yeah.
thing. I can see pregnant women, I can see pregnant relations, and it does not trigger me. And I've done some work on that piece, and I believe it's because while I was going through the birth of my oldest via the surrogate or the gestational carrier, I went through that mourning piece. Like
Mm,
I grieved my body's loss to be able to do that, you know? So it's interesting because with this like new announcement within our family, it's not that I don't, that I'm going to get triggered by seeing her pregnant or anything
mhm,
like that. It's more of purely the fact that they could.
mhm.
That's what triggered it,
Yeah.
you know? Um, because I feel nothing, when it comes to like the loss of being able to be pregnant. And that's because it also comes from the fact that I know that my children do not know. I mean, just because I didn't like carry them doesn't mean they don't recognize me as their mother.
Right.
Because I guarantee you, if you put if you put me and the gestational carrier in a room, if they want their mom, they know exactly who to come to,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, there's a little bit of confidence in that piece, but what was the bigger trigger was that loss of opportunity, which is what I've been stuck in anger with.
Right. Right. And it's like, it's interesting because I think, yes, it's true that you can have children and all these things, but I think there is still truth, and it's valid to recognize the truth that you can't carry a child and can't just get pregnant. Like, you can't just get pregnant. There is a process. And I think that is kind of what you are in the space of, like, you were angry for so long about it, but then it's like, okay, so let's move through the sadness, the acceptance, all of that, so that you can be at the same place that you are when you see pregnant women, as when you hear someone get, like, announce that they're pregnant, right? And I think, obviously, I believe that you can get to that space as well, just because you've gotten through the other spaces. But I love that you're able to talk about it now and be able to share that that's something that you are grieving later on, because I think so many people avoid going through the full process of grief. And that's where we get stuck, and we cause ourselves so much suffering that is unnecessary. And it's like, there's parts of us where we feel like we've been done wrong, and it's totally okay, because it's like, yeah, and acknowledging that fact, like, I've been done wrong, something's been taken from me, and I'm still grateful for my kids, and I'm gonna move forward, and I can just acknowledge that that was an experience that I don't get to experience, that I thought I was gonna experience. And then, like, this other thing I want to point out is, like, what your story really, like, kind of brings home to me is that we paint this picture of what we want and how we think it is going to look, and the road that we are going to follow to get there. And I think your story so beautifully shows that it's not like, if we focus on, like, how we're going to get there, and we try to paint that picture, that's where disappointment comes in. That's where a lot of, like, the drama comes in, versus, like, your goal you met. It just looked a hell of a lot different than you ever expected. And so I think that that's so beautiful, because I think that's most of life, right? Like we try to paint this, like, picture of, like, okay, this is the goal, and this is how I'm going to get here, and, like, it's going to check all these boxes. And it's like, but the reality of it is, we want the end result because of the feeling that we're going to get. So we want the result of having children. And like, the fact is like, it didn't look the way that you wanted it for 28 years, but how fruitful is it at the end? It's still just as sweet. It's still just as amazing. And I think that is, like, such a beautiful theme here, is, like, to really drive in that like, really, the end destination, you can still get there, even if it's not the way that you thought it would be. And you can grieve the process that it's not the way that you wanted it to be, the journey, but you can also be appreciative for the end result that you've gotten and created. And I think that you do a beautiful job of that.
Thank you. Yeah, but no, 100%, like what you're saying. I think I've really embraced this whole notion of, like, you have a vision, you have a goal, whatever you want to call it. Your next best course of action is to just take a guess at what the next step is, because everyone's going to have a different opinion on what that next step should be. So all you can do is, like, take all the examples, choose one, try it, and if it doesn't work, make adjustments. You know? So I'm a huge proponent. I think I heard this phrase kind of being used in a training I was watching, where it's like, take a guess, try it, make adjustments. And it's just something that's stood out to me because, since my diagnosis, I knew that the life I was leading was not necessarily what I wanted. But I didn't exactly know what that looked like, until I had my oldest, and then I realized, well, I want more time. So how do I create more time? And so what I've been doing with a lot of my pivots is taking that guess, trying it out, and then making adjustments.
I love that.
And, my pivot into coaching, my husband laughs because he's like, it's kind of full circle. You're coming back into human resources. And I'm like, but it's different because it still has my time motivator at its core, because there was no way I could be doing what I'm doing now when I made my first pivot into aesthetics.
Yeah.
Because working from home was not an option. It just wasn't a thing. So it's that whole notion of, taking everything into consideration. My perspective changed, where I wasn't driven by status anymore after my cancer diagnosis. I wasn't driven necessarily by money anymore. I was driven by time. I want control over my time. Because there's already so much I can't control.
Right. Yeah. 100%.
There's already
life
so
has
much
showed
that's
you
going.
that.
Yeah, exactly. So the best I can do is roll with it, but while I'm rolling with it, like, I want to have a say, in how I'm spending my time, what I'm doing during that time.
That's amazing. I mean, what a powerful story, and what great perspective to have after experiencing all that you've experienced, and take it into your own hands to help other people experience that without having to go through what you have been through. I love that. I think, I don't think that people need to necessarily have cancer and go through all these traumatic things
100%.
to do that. And
exactly.
So you're there to teach them, like, you've taken that and you have given that perspective to others, and you've taken your experience and created that pain, or you've taken that pain and you've created purpose out of it. And it's so beautiful to see, and it's so powerful. And I want to say thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and for being open about it, and for being willing to talk about even the things that you're still processing in regards to it, because I think there's so much power in that, because I think people want to just be healed and it be done. And so for you to share your successes and still be processing and share that with us, I think there are going to be so many people that find so much value in your story. I know I've heard, I've heard it before, and I totally admire you and how you've gone about everything. And I just think it's so beautiful that you have been able to create the life that you have, and have the two beautiful children, and be able to be this beautiful version of you. And so again, I want to say thank you for joining me today and allowing me the space to give you the space to share your story and get it out there, because I know there's so much value in it.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate you having me on. And I think, one of the biggest takeaways and drivers is, you don't need to wait for something dramatic or drastic or traumatic to happen to your life to make changes. If you are already feeling the urge, like if you're already feeling the call to do something different, that's all you need.
Do it. Do
Yeah,
it. Yes, I
essentially.
agree.
Yes.
I
Yes.
agree.
Yeah.
So before we go, I like to talk with my guests about what I should name the episode.
Okay.
So what would you think would be a good name for this episode?
Oh man. I don't know. It's just, well, I feel like we covered a lot of different things. Hopefully people can follow it. I'm not sure it was very succinct, but I don't know. What have you been thinking?
Let's see. I mean, because I feel like, I don't know, I feel like you have gained so much power in not letting like your diagnosis be your identity, but also having it be such a perspective shift. So like
Mm-hmm.
something about that, like how it's like not your
Mm-hmm.
identity, but it's created your new identity.
Yeah. So maybe
Ooh.
like your trauma doesn't have to be you.
Ooh, your trauma doesn't have to be you. I like it. I like it.
Or you are not your trauma.
You are not your trauma. I like that too.
How have you been naming them?
So it just depends on the episode.
Mm-hmm.
But also like part of me in this sense is like it kind of like in a way like you're creating your identity after trauma. Like that's kind of what you've done
Mm-hmm.
is like you
Yes.
created like
Mm-hmm.
creating your identity after a diagnosis, creating your
Mm-hmm.
identity after the trauma, because I
Mm-hmm.
think people create their identity around the trauma
Mm-hmm.
versus
Mm-hmm.
creating it after and like forming this new identity that's not the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh,
Mm-hmm.
creating new identity that is not the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Life after a cancer diagnosis. What do you feel?
Or yeah, or something like I'm a cancer survivor last.
Oh, that's it. I'm a cancer survivor. That's it. See, we just had to work through it a little bit. That's it. I'm a cancer survivor last. I love that. And then before we end this, tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So because I focus on career changes, pivots, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. Just look up Demelza Lawless, and you should see my face. But you can also find me online at demelzalawless.com.
Perfect. Thank you again. I love it. I am so grateful for you, and I just appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Katie, and I appreciate you and everything you do.
Thank you.